Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 12 audio lecture for English 1010. There's a couple of things that I want to do for this week, and I'll say this a couple of times throughout this lecture, definitely take some time and watch the additional resources videos that I posted to Yuja, and this is available in or on D2L, because what I want to talk about today, there are two big concepts in addition to the reading that I want to talk about today. One of them is the online databases and the peer review process, and the other is how to incorporate borrowed material, but there are distinct limits to what I can effectively teach you if you were to simply listen to this audio lecture and only this audio lecture. I would argue having that visual aid or those visual aids, having those examples will certainly enhance your learning and enhance your understanding, but I at least want to spend a little bit of time talking about it here in this medium, simply because having someone explain perhaps at times challenging concepts in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different mediums, is really the best way to learn. So yeah, I'll talk about the reading near the end, but take some time, maybe listen to this audio lecture, then go and watch those videos in Yuja. And where I want to start today is with the online databases and the peer review process. So one of the overarching goals for this class, one of the things that I really want to teach you in particular in this unit is digital internet literacy, which is to say, I want you to have a better sense of how to interrogate information, to perhaps understand the degree to which something has validity and credibility in contrast to something that may not. And one of the things that I want you to do is use the information depending on your topic. And of course, everything I say really throughout this whole unit, it's all contingent on your topic. But I want you to use the resources that we have made available to you through the library, through those online academic library databases. And one of the reasons why is because an overwhelming majority of that information, it's available to you, but it was published after it was subjected to what is called the peer review process. And so for those of you who don't know what it means for an essay or a piece of researched material to be peer reviewed, I wanted to take a second and explain it. So basically, here's the idea. So I want you to imagine, for example, someone wants to publish an essay or something they researched, but they just publish it to their blog. Right? So they have a blog and they write this, and let's imagine they have the best of intentions, right? Let us imagine they have no intention of deceiving someone. They want people to read their work. They want their work to be credible, but it's just them, right? So they do the research, they do the reading, they do the writing, and they publish it. Now, that's one way of publishing information, but by contrast, there's the peer review process. So for the peer review process, the writing and the researching itself might look quite similar. However, before an academic journal would then publish that research, someone, or in many cases, 2 or 3 people within a particular field or discipline would read a potential paper or essay for publication and offer feedback before the journal in question would publish it. And so pause for a second and think about the editing process and how having someone read and review your work, offer suggestions, and it's not just anyone, right? It's someone. So if we wanted to use an example, let us say I wanted to write an essay about inflation, right? So if a particular essay that I wrote was peer reviewed, that means other economists, specifically or hopefully particularly economists who are interested in inflation as an economic phenomenon, they would then read my work and offer feedback. And so what I want you to really think about is how that essay, while I am not trying to suggest that all peer-reviewed essays are right, I am not trying to suggest that you should always trust a peer-reviewed essay in contrast to anything else. What I am, however, trying to suggest is that information, it might, in theory, if you were just making a wager, I think you would be correct in wagering that peer-reviewed information theoretically has more credibility because of the rigorous editing and review process that's required of the peer review process. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough. One of the things that I want you to understand is that we are not, any of us, whether it's you or me or anyone else, the goal is not to find unbiased, objective information, because quite frankly, it doesn't exist. Anytime a human being involves themselves in something, it becomes subjective. Now, that is not to say that there is not a process to, let us say, mitigate some of those subjective aspects and elements, because there absolutely is. But the goal, your goal, my goal, anyone's goal who wants to produce information and knowledge, the goal, I would argue, should be to have certain intellectual mechanisms in place so that you can better understand someone's bias, for example. You can understand and assess, and again, thinking of this as less of a binary. So there's credible information and information that lacks credibility. Let's just completely dismiss that way of thinking. Instead, imagine that everything, any potential piece of information, researched material, etc., let us imagine it all exists on a continuum, and some information possesses more or greater credibility, while some information possesses less or is less credible, is perhaps more suspect. And so the goal or the idea, what I want you to develop, is really a sense of what makes something credible and what might make information, researched information, essays, papers, articles, etc., what might make that information less credible. And what I want to suggest is that on the whole, more often than not, peer-reviewed information, because of that editing process, it has greater credibility, or there is simply the potential that it has greater credibility. But I think building on this is perhaps something that might help, really, is understanding what it means for an academic journal to publish information. And again, perhaps in contrast to a blog that someone might keep, or even, relatively credible websites that publish information on a daily basis. Academic journals that use the peer review process, they may publish issues once every 3 or 4 months, once every 6 months. The publication schedule is perhaps far less frequent than something you might see just on the internet, for example. And again, the thing I would ask you to consider is this: does the infrequency of publication enhance or perhaps detract from the potential credibility of a piece? Because I would argue it actually enhances the credibility. Because, and just think about your own work, for example. If you have more time to think about a topic, more time to brainstorm, more time to draft, more time to write, in theory, and all of this is just theoretical, right? In theory, it creates the conditions for you to produce better work, because more time can perhaps provide you with an opportunity to think through the points and arguments you want to make. It creates opportunities for you to allow different individuals with different voices and different thoughts a chance to read your work. But if you are, by contrast, publishing every single day, if you have, instead of a 2, 3, or 4 month deadline, if you have a 2, 3, 4 hour deadline, I think you can see how questions of credibility become far clearer, right? You would probably want that peer-reviewed information because, again, theoretically, the amount of time, how these academic journals publish, that would create the conditions for greater credibility. By contrast, a website or someone who keeps a blog who publishes every single day, because of that rigorous publication schedule, their information may have less rigor, or it may have, again, theoretically less credibility by contrast, or in contrast to a peer-reviewed piece of information. And something else to think about as well is, and this is perhaps not true of some websites. If you take, for example, a policy website like Vox, V-O-X, Vox.com, you can find information about the authors and writers. Again, it's not like a blog that's operated by an anonymous person who you may have no idea who this person is. Do they have any credentials whatsoever? Anytime someone publishes in a peer-reviewed academic journal, you as the researcher, you as the person who's conducting research, hoping to use that information, you'll know exactly who it is because they put their names and their credentials to their work. And so that affords you an opportunity to then research this person. Do I have reason to think they're credible? And that's, again, something else to think about that's so incredibly important. What do you know about the writer and author, or the writers and authors of a particular piece that you perhaps want to use in your own research essay? Do I know a lot about this person? Do I not know a lot about this person? How might that help me better understand the degree to which they are credible? And something else to think about as well, and this is the final thing I'll say about the peer review process and really just assessing the credibility of a particular piece of researched information. Just do yourself the favor of, before even reading the essay, just skim through it and see how often they cite sources that you have access to. Because I think this is also incredibly important, and I think this is maybe more important with non-peer-reviewed, non-academic sources, but I think this is incredibly useful and relevant for information that you might find just on the internet. Because listen, it's really easy, as I'm sure all of you perhaps know and understand, it's really easy for someone to just say whatever the hell they want on their blog without citing any information, or if they cite information and then you try to follow those citations, or typically those hyperlinks, because that's how citation standards work on blogs and most websites. It's really easy for someone to just, I don't know, cite something or hyperlink to something that is just utter nonsense, right? So take a second and actually look and see, well, how often are they citing information? Is it easy? Is it quite easy for me to then follow those citations or to follow those links to understand what informs their argument? Do those links actually work? Do those hyperlinks actually lead to something? Or is it perhaps a hyperlink that's there, designed in theory to create the impression of credibility, when in fact it's just, I don't know, a bridge to nowhere, right? So those are things to think about and consider when attempting to assess the credibility of a piece. And I hope through that comparison you understand why, again, in theory, peer-reviewed information is preferable, because all of what I've discussed, all of those particulars that enhance the credibility of a piece, more often than not, it is baked into the peer review process. And again, peer-reviewed information, sometimes it's available on Google, but it's a lot easier to find and identify those peer-reviewed sources using the online academic library databases. And I illustrate how to do that in, again, the additional resources that are available in UJA. So now I want to take a second and at least talk about how to incorporate borrowed material into your research essay, because this is one of the most important parts or aspects of a research essay. It's taking other people's work and incorporating it or integrating it into your own work. And broadly speaking, there are three ways to do this. And again, whether it's additional resource videos or materials that are in the research essay module, I've provided a lot of examples about how to do this. But you could paraphrase, you could summarize, or you could quote directly. And I'll leave it to you to go and find particular definitions and examples of all of those. But the thing to keep in mind, the thing to remember is part of what it means to write a research essay is to integrate and incorporate researched material into your own work. So please keep that in mind. It's not enough for you just to do research and have a works cited page. I want you to incorporate that information into your essay. That's part of how you will support whatever argument or thesis statement you have. It's with that researched material. So instead of, for example, like you have in previous essays, using the resources of personal experience, you'll primarily, and I'll talk about potentially using personal experience in a moment, you will primarily use researched material as a way of supporting and developing your arguments and your larger claims. And one of the big important ideas that I want you to understand, and something to definitely avoid, is what is called dumping or dropping quotes. And there's a couple of different ways, or it could be also summarized or paraphrased material. So perhaps a better way of saying that is dumping or dropping borrowed material. And there are a couple of ways to unsuccessfully, and so when I use language like dump or drop, what I basically mean is an aspect of how you've incorporated borrowed material, it's perhaps not correct, or there are things you need to do to correctly incorporate borrowed material. And I'll start with signal phrases and in-text citations. So a signal phrase, and again, this is relevant whether it's a summary, a paraphrase, or a direct quote, it's language that you create that helps to introduce the material you have borrowed and researched that you want to incorporate into your own essay. And it could sound as simple as something like this: Joe Johnson writes, and then you would perhaps have a direct quote or a paraphrase or a summary. And I want you to think about why having those kinds of signal phrases really matter. Part of it's because it certainly enhances readability, and that's something that you as the writer should be sensitive to, and that's something to be acutely aware of, because there are, again, right and wrong ways to incorporate borrowed material, and one of the worst ways to do it is to have this unbelievable piece of researched material, but you clumsily incorporate it into your essay. And that's the thing to avoid. And one of the ways to avoid doing that is to have a clear and readable signal phrase. And again, I provide some examples on D2L, different verbs you can use, because perhaps you would find it, and this is understandable, you might think your reader might find the verb writes to be a bit boring and repetitive. Okay, that's fine. Just vary your verbs. But something else that creating and having signal phrases do, they signal, as the term suggests, to your reader that, hey, you are about to encounter borrowed material. And I think that's incredibly helpful, because part of what makes research essays at times so challenging to read for an audience who perhaps is not someone like myself, someone who teaches writing, is differentiating or distinguishing between borrowed material, perhaps analysis, or other patterns the writer wants to use as a way of developing their argument or claim. So having those clear signal phrases does a lot of important work for your essay. But you must also have what are called in-text citations, and that's the information that appears in parentheses after the material you have borrowed. Again, whether it's a direct quote, a paraphrase, or a summary. And again, definitely go to the resources that I provided on D2L, because it's a little tricky to explain in an exclusive audio format exactly what it is. But often it's really just the page number or numbers of the material you have borrowed. So let us say, for example, you have an essay that this Joe Johnson person wrote, and you borrow 2 lines from page maybe 15. In parentheses, in that in-text citation, if you have his name in the signal phrase, all you would need is the number 15 in the in-text citation. And again, it's really, really challenging for me to explain this exclusively in an audio format, so definitely take the time to go and review my examples. But if we're thinking about, well, how can we avoid dumping or dropping quotes? Having signal phrases and in-text citations, that's extremely important for the reasons that I've just described. It enhances readability, and it also signals to your reader that they are about to encounter borrowed material. But there's more you need to do, because it's not enough, and I think this is such an important and a crucial concept for students to understand. It is not enough for you to conduct research and then just put it in an essay. You need to also contextualize that information, which is to say, you need to explain how that information supports and develops your thesis statement. It is not acceptable for you to leave it to your reader to surmise how the information you've cited supports and develops your thesis statement. And I think visually, this is not always true, but more often than not, it is. If I read through an essay and a lot of paragraphs end with those in-text citations, that bit in parentheses, I often have questions. I'm often skeptical of that, because that potentially implies, again, not always and not in every case, but it potentially implies the student in question has not thoroughly unpacked, and that's the language that I like to use, they have not thoroughly unpacked the material they've borrowed. So keep that in mind as well. If you're thinking about, as you should, how can I effectively integrate borrowed material? You need those signal phrases, you need those in-text citations, but you also need to do the work of analyzing, unpacking, and explaining how the material you borrow supports your thesis statement. That's something that I will certainly pay attention to, and that is a significant part of your grade, because that's really the big distinction between a research essay and, for example, a compare and contrast essay that does not have researched material. If you are not successfully integrating and incorporating that borrowed material, then you have in many ways failed at the primary objective for this assignment. So keep all of those things in mind. And again, I've said it a couple of times, I'll say it again, definitely avail yourself of the resources that I've made available in USIA and in the content tab in the research essay module. Okay, so now I want to take a quick second and say a couple of things about some of the reading that I asked you to do for this week. And I want to keep this video short because I know I've asked you to go and watch other videos, which is also time consuming. And I know you have other assignments in other classes, and I just want to keep this as manageable as possible. And the one essay that I really wanted to talk about is the Kim Morgan essay, Dementia, My Grandmother's Journey, because this essay, part of what I like about this essay so much is how the student, by my estimation, successfully incorporates her personal experiences, which is to say, she uses narrative as a pattern in an essay that also has researched material, which I think is incredibly interesting, because I think far too often when we think about writing research essays, we often think, well, I must, if I had permission in other essays or with other essays to incorporate personal experience, I should definitely preclude that as an option, or I should consider personal experience and narrative as not an option for this research essay. But I would certainly push back against that and suggest that actually, no, you can. You can totally use, if done successfully, and I suppose anything and everything is really a matter of the degree to which you do it successfully. I think there's certainly a place in research essays for personal experience, for narrative as a pattern. And I think this essay, Kim Morgan's essay on her grandmother's dementia, is an excellent example of how to blend researched material with narrative and personal experience. And what I like so much about this essay, and what I think is so incredibly instructive about this essay, is how Morgan uses those experiences as a means of developing and supporting her larger claim through that researched material. So instead of conducting, for example, which I think she does this as well, but instead of conducting at times a sober analysis of the material she researches, she pivots from her grandmother's experiences. So she'll incorporate borrowed material and then she'll connect it to things she observed that happened to her grandmother. And I think that is an incredibly interesting and unique way of imagining a research essay. It's an opportunity potentially to use personal experience as a way of developing and as a way of unpacking some of those borrowed materials or some of that researched material. And again, I think this is something that's highly dependent and contingent on the topic you select. I think you can see why, for someone like Morgan, using narrative and personal experience makes a kind of sense, whereas it may not make sense in other contexts with other topics. But I think the Morgan essay, if you're someone, for example, and this is ultimately my point, if you are someone who really enjoyed those opportunities when you could use narrative and personal experience, and perhaps you were bemoaning the assumption you made, or this assumption that you could not do that here, my point is, depending on your topic, depending on the execution, you absolutely can do it here. There is no reason why I am not placing some kind of moratorium on the use of narrative and personal experience for this essay. So please keep that in mind and use the Morgan essay as an example. But part of what I also, one of the reasons why, let me say that again, one of the reasons why I asked you to read these essays is because there are some aspects of these essays that are not perfect. For example, the Kimberly Mann essay on visas and immigration, I would argue, in particular with the introduction, and you can see this occasionally throughout the essay, it's at times an essay that seems a little confused about what it's arguing, which I think is a distinct problem. You know, there are times when I think this essay, it's less about, for example, immigrants and in particular immigrant visas, and more about, I don't know, the author's assumptions about work ethic, which I don't know how that's relevant to a question about visas, at least not in the way that Mann frames it. And I would also say with someone like Kim Morgan's essay, there are some times when I think her thesis statement could be a bit stronger. It feels as if her thesis statement is more a statement of fact and less of, for example, an argumentative position that someone might assume. So while I think all of these essays have some distinct strengths, I think there are also some unfortunate weaknesses that offer perhaps opportunities for you to think about things to potentially avoid for your essays. Because again, I am asking you to write an argumentative essay, not an informative essay. So those are just things to keep in mind. But definitely do the work of reading those essays, thinking about them, thinking about both what those essays do that you would like to replicate, but if there are potential mistakes, how you can avoid those mistakes. So, okay, I think that's all I want to say for this week. There's no benchmark due this week, but there is one due next week, so continue working. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. So, thank you. This is Colin Cox for English 1010. Have a lovely week.